beer, it's good for you.
Hello and welcome to the video. Within this video I'll be walking you through the whole process and recipe for my very tried and tested raspberry wit beer, so let's get started. The first area of preparation with this recipe is the actual fruit itself. This process needs to be started ahead of the actual brew. I suggest that you at the very least freeze your fruit for 3 days, but a safer practice is also to add the fruit into a solution of sodium metabisulfate to sanitize it, and you need to do this for about 10 minutes. A popular term used for this chemical is Campden tablets. After treating the fruit in this way, you will need to wait 24 hours before using it, otherwise the chemicals could upset your yeast. You should also make sure that you have plenty of time to let the fruit thaw fully before you add it to your fermenter. I will walk you through the rest of the process later on in this video at the appropriate point. Also ahead of your brew, you should plan your water profile. Here is the profile that I recommend, which can be found within Brewfather. This profile offers a good balance and will work nicely with this wit with consideration of fruit. Naturally, if you have found a water profile for similar beers in the past that you really like, then you should run with that instead. Let's now go through my tried and tested recipe along with the brewing process where I use the Brewzilla 35 all-in-one brewing system, though this recipe will suit all other brewing systems too. I am sharing this recipe in full within this video's description with both metric and imperial measurements, as well as a link to the recipe on Brewfather, which is free to use with few limitations, so as such is ideal for everyone. If you are going to use this recipe with a different brewing system or method, then you will need to convert it, mostly to cover the water. This is easily done with Brewfather by simply changing the equipment section. Within this area of Brewfather you can also scale the recipe to the volume that you desire, if different from mine. You should then replace my ingredients with your own and ensure the values for IBU and gravity match that for the original. This is easily done by having the recipe in the video's description for reference. Let's now start the mash. You can see here that the mash is on the foamy side, at least to start with. Do not be concerned about this, it is not surprising considering the grain bill used here, which we will come on to shortly. Here is the mash profile for this recipe. You will note a slightly higher temperature than the common 65 Celsius 149 degrees Fahrenheit, which is typical for this beer style with a view to balancing off the final gravity. The difference that this will make with modern malt is arguable though. I have to add though that with my testing and taste palette I at the very least detect subtle differences, but not everyone will, as taste sensitivity is a variable too. I did have someone say on my Facebook group not so long ago that the science backs up that there will be no difference these days with modern malt, but then I am sure we all should realise that scientists in general argue with each other. My suggestion is to try both ways and see where the two examples put your taste buds. Here we are now in the middle of this mash and the foam is starting to clear. Let's now take a look at this recipe's vitals and grain bill. Here we have an expected ABV of 5%, which is a fair average for this style. As you can see, we also have a pretty low IBU, which along with the alcohol level gives a BUG ratio of 0.27, which puts this one in the correct area for the style, being something that is not bitter, though being beer it is not exactly sweet either, of course. Moving on to the grain bill, and here you can see the two prime reasons for all this foam, though naturally we will see much more of it during the boil. Here we have wheat malt at 45% and flaked oats at 5%. Both of these elements of the grain bill will contribute texture, body and flavour. You will find that wheat malt in particular is actually very hard to predict in terms of its yield or gravity. This is essentially because wheat growers are really just interested in the food aspect of the business, and due to this there are no breeding programs for wheat for brewing. If the topic of wheat interests you from a brewing perspective, then I've put together a guide that explains the different types of wheat for brewing and how to use them on this channel. Just search for wheat and David Heath on YouTube and you will find it. Due to this fairly high combined content of wheat and oats, you may wish to consider using rice or oat hulls for filtration during this mash to avoid sticking, especially if you have an already fine grain crush. Here is how this mash looked a little bit later, still not clear, but that does not matter, and frankly you shouldn't really expect that with anything that involves this amount of wheat and oats. Also within the fermentables of this recipe we have Munich malt and pale ale malt, which I have split at 25% each. These both carry the main fermentable elements of this recipe. The pale ale will not really contribute anything else in terms of this grain bill, but the Munich malt will give this grain bill a sweeter and more malty element that blends in very nicely with the rest of the grain bill and of course the raspberries. I then moved on to the sparge, which was done by hand evenly over the top plate to ensure that I picked up as much efficiency as possible. I then moved on to the boil, and here is the level of foam from all of the protein in this grain bill. I gave this a good skim and stir so that I kept the protein in the beer where it belongs. Once the head was mostly clear, it was time to start the boil timer and add the first and only hop addition, so let's take a closer look at the boil for this recipe. So as you can see, this has a boil time of just 30 minutes and 1 addition, so this is a very simple boil. This is essentially due to the style and the fact that we have a fruit addition later on that will be commanding much of the flavour. So due to that, our only job here is to balance the beer in terms of its alcohol versus bitterness. No hops are added for flavour whatsoever. I do recommend that you do add some yeast nutrients into your boil schedule though, as they provide a great insurance policy. That's the thing with insurance, you never know when you will need it. I then cooled my wort and started transfer into my fermenter. Once I had a small amount of wort present, I then pitched my yeast and rehydrated it with the cooled wort flow. I find this to be a very effective technique for minimising yeast lag. When it comes to yeast, I am using and recommend Lallemand Belgian wheat yeast, but I have also had good results with MJ-M21. Personally, I do not use liquid yeast anymore, but if you have a liquid yeast suggestion for this style that you can recommend, then feel free to mention it in the comment section of this video. In terms of fermentation temperature when using Lallemand yeast, I use the following temperature schedule shown on screen. Let me explain. The first temperature in blue is the main temperature for fermentation. Use this until you see that you are between 5 to 10 gravity points away from your predicted final gravity. This should take between 2 to 4 days. You can then add your fruit and stay at this temperature for 1 more day. Then raising at 1 degree C over 2 days reach the final temperature shown here in red. I suggest that you leave this all in the fermenter for a total duration of no less than 7 days to ensure that you have a full fermentation completion. Now I have jumped ahead a little bit here, but I think it is better to have all the fermentation information in one place. Let's now go through the handling of the fruit, which is placed in the middle of what we've just discussed. For this particular fruit, I recommend the use of 2 plastic vessels that are marked as suitable for use with food. Here is the first vessel, and inside are 2 hop bags that I'm going to use for the fruit. Instead of boiling these like in my last fruit video, I'm going to use a standard brewery wash cleaner similar to PPW and all the other alternatives out there now. Make sure that you use water at the right temperature for your cleaner and fill the container to the top. Because our containers are plastic, you must limit the contact time to a maximum of 20 minutes, otherwise you will compromise the plastic, but a total of 10 minutes is probably going to be enough. Next, take your second container and add the hop bags and transfer the cleaner. I must add that this is only suitable if your containers are at the least visibly clean in the start. With your first container, add some hot plain water to wash away the cleaner. Leave both containers now for a further 10 to 20 minutes. When it comes to water rinsing your container with the hot bags in it, I suggest filling with a small amount of water and pouring out a few times before fully filling it with water. This will ensure that the cleaner is fully rinsed from the bags. Then fully remove all water and add sanitizer to both containers. I recommend a contact time of at least 3 minutes for sanitization. You should then remove the sanitizer from both of your containers. Now both of your containers are clean and sanitary, you can now add your fruit into one of them. As explained earlier, this needs to be in a fully thawed, unfrozen state. Your other container should contain the hop bags that we're going to use for the fruit that are also now clean and sanitary. Let's face it, everyone these days has hand sanitizer and it's very useful here. To avoid contamination of your beer, you need to use this at the start of the fruit filling process and also at any time that your hand or fingers touch anything that is outside of the clean and sanitary zone that we have created here. By the end of the fruit filling process, your fruit container is going to look something like this. So almost like a murder scene in ways, really, but we know better of course. Make sure that all fruit is on the inside of your bags. There will of course be some juice also. whereas your other container will more than likely have very small bits of fruit and juice. If you like, pour this juice and the small bits into the fruit bags. Just be sure not to add these small bits of fruit into your fermenter straight, because they could well clog up your fermenter or siphon during your final transfer to a keg or bottles. As I have mentioned in all previous fruit beer videos, it is vital that you at the very least dump the trub from your fermenter, if you are able to, with the fermenter that you use before adding your fruit. If not, then you will need to prepare a second clean and sanitary fermenter and using a siphon perform a transfer. The reason you must do this is that otherwise you will have a very compromised result, commonly with an end beer tasting very unclean. It is of course much better to pour out your trub down your sink rather than the entire beer. You can now remove your fermenter lid and remember to sanitize the hand that is going to add your fruit into your fermenter. When adding the fruit, do not throw it into the fermenter because we do not wish to create a splash, because this would potentially lead to the onset of oxidization, which will cause your beer to become stale much quicker. Because this recipe contains wheat and oats, we need to be especially careful of this, because both of these are volatile in this way. Brewing with fruit is certainly a little bit more work, but those extra flavours go a long way and cannot be replicated with other methods. Do note that we are only adding the fruit here during late fermentation, and we are certainly not going to boil it. Boiling fruit is frankly a very bad way to go, whereas adding fruit cleanly like this during late fermentation will add in very clean, vibrant fruit flavours. Let's now look at the resulting beer before I give you some tasting notes. Here you can see a close-up of the pour coming from my faucet. Here is the same pour shown into a glass. Due to the simple fact that this is a wheat beer, it really should look cloudy in the way that you see it here. However, if you would rather have it clear, then this is your choice, and you can certainly add in some steps for clarity to achieve this. For pointers, have a look at my Homebrewer Clarity Guide on this channel. Let's now move on to the tasting, starting with aroma. We have an aroma of very fresh raspberry that has some delicate spice and grain in the background. When it comes to flavour, there is fresh and clean raspberry on entry with elements of wheat, with a touch of spice in the middle, leading to a smooth and easy finish. In terms of notes, I really enjoy how easy drinking this example of the style is. There is nothing here to really put off any type of drinker, unless they do not like raspberry, of course. The impression this beer gives is that this is a very good example of how fresh and clean fruit can taste in a wheat beer. This is not a very complex beer at all, but it certainly is very refreshing, and people seem to find it impossible to have just one glass of it. Which is perfectly fine, as this is only 5% ABV, and to date nobody has climbed up on my table and burst into song after just 2 pints of it. You can rest assured though that if they ever do, then I will share the resulting video footage with you. I do hope that you found this video useful, informative and interesting. If so, why not consider liking and subscribing? For further support, you can join the channel's Facebook group, and if you would like to support the channel, then check out the channel's merchandise store, as all profits go back into the channel. Until next time, happy brewing!